In the grand narrative of modern economic history, few monetary policy confrontations carry as much geopolitical weight as the stark contrast between Jerome Powell, chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve, and Elvira Nabiullina, governor of the Central Bank of Russia. This is not merely an academic debate over interest rates or the money supply. It is a fundamental clash of philosophies, a collision at the very core of how the state and the market should interact. It represents a battle between two national models, two distinct economic ideologies that are carving out entirely different spheres of influence on the global financial map. The United States champions a model built on the supremacy of free markets, while Russia has chosen the path of state power and structural control. In this episode, we will dissect each model in depth, exploring their origins, their operational mechanics, their strategic vulnerabilities, and the critical lessons they offer the world. To truly understand why Jerome Powell and Elvira Nabiullina have pursued such divergent paths, we must first place each of them within their unique strategic contexts. Jerome Powell operates the levers of the Federal Reserve in what economists would traditionally describe as a normal environment, albeit one profoundly destabilized by the shocks of a post-pandemic world. The American economy is, at its heart, a service-based economy, with this sector contributing over 70% to its GDP. Its vitality depends on the maximum mobility of capital and the smooth functioning of globalized supply chains. The inflation Powell confronts is what can be termed endogenous inflation, a direct result of prolonged loose monetary policy. Massive fiscal stimulus injections during the pandemic, and a powerful pent-up demand rebound that followed. Powell's guiding philosophy is one rooted in an unwavering trust in market forces. From this perspective, inflation is predominantly a demand-side imbalance. Too much money chasing too few goods. Consequently, the solution is not to intervene deeply in supply chains or production structures, but rather to cool aggregate demand. The Federal Reserve's primary mission, therefore, is to adjust the price of money, the federal funds rate, to methodically slow the economy's momentum. Powell operates on the belief that markets, if given the right signals, will self-correct. The state's role is simply to provide those signals, acting as a guide rather than a commander. His stated objective is to steer inflation back to its 2% target through a meticulously managed soft landing, an outcome where inflation is tamed without triggering a severe and damaging recession. Elvira Nabiullina, by stark contrast, found herself in an entirely different reality, a full-scale economic war. In the wake of Russia's exclusion from the SWIFT international payment system and the imposition of thousands of sanctions by Western nations, the Russian economy was plunged into a state of siege. The inflation she faced was not a simple internal imbalance. It was transformed into a geopolitical weapon, actively wielded by the West, with the explicit goal of destabilizing Russia's financial system and fomenting domestic unrest. Russia's immediate and existential problem was a collapsing supply chain, crippled by sanctions and a torrent of massive capital flight as fear gripped the markets. Nabiullina quickly understood that applying the traditional playbook of tightening demand under such siege conditions would be tantamount to economic suicide, as it would only serve to further destroy an already weakened and isolated productive capacity. Her response was not to cool demand, but to impose structural control and mount a defensive production. She mobilized the full, unyielding power of the state to seize control of capital flows, stabilize the ruble by anchoring it to real, tangible assets, and aggressively push a national strategy of strategic self-sufficiency. In essence, her actions shifted the entire economy into a wartime footing. Her first objective was brutally simple, yet absolutely critical: ensure the financial system survived the initial 24-hour shock. Once a semblance of stability was achieved, the strategic focus pivoted toward a complete restructuring of the economy designed to endure long-term sanctions. National survival was elevated above all other concerns, including the orthodox economic principles of market efficiency. This profound divergence in strategy produced a striking paradox. The United States, operating in peacetime, grappled with stubbornly persistent inflation and an exploding public debt, while Russia, under the duress of unprecedented economic warfare, managed to achieve lower-than-expected inflation and even GDP growth fueled largely by its defensive mechanisms and a surge in military spending. The Powell model represents the classic anti-inflation playbook of economic liberalism, a doctrine defined by its absolute faith in the self-regulating power of the market. The primary instrument in this toolkit is the interest rate hike, a macroeconomic lever designed to raise borrowing costs across the entire economy, thereby slowing consumer spending and discouraging corporate investment. This monetary tightening is complemented by quantitative tightening, a process where the central bank systematically withdraws liquidity from the financial system. This forces banks and corporations to restructure their balance sheets, abandon riskier projects that were once viable in an era of cheap money, and adopt a more cautious financial posture. In this model, the Federal Reserve's role is to provide clear price signals. The market is then trusted to handle the complex task of resource allocation. However, this model is not without significant costs. In a deeply interconnected global economy, consistently high U.S. interest rates introduce substantial systemic risk. Trillions of dollars in U.S. public debt must now be refinanced at these higher costs, creating immense fiscal pressure on the government and inevitably reducing its future capacity for spending on critical areas like healthcare, education, and infrastructure. Furthermore, high interest rates act as a powerful brake on long-term investment, particularly in capital-intensive sectors such as green energy and deep technology, which are vital for future economic growth and competitiveness. On the international stage, the Fed's aggressive tightening campaign triggers a dollar shock. The strengthening U.S. dollar drains capital from developing economies. It's making their own borrowing costs more expensive and sharply increasing the real burden of their dollar-denominated debt. What began as America's internal inflation problem has now metastasized into a source of global financial contagion. Moreover, the Powell model demonstrates a significant weakness when confronted with supply shock inflation, such as the surging energy and food prices caused by war or natural disasters. Suppressing demand can slow the economy, but it does nothing to fix the underlying shortage of essential goods. This model, while effective in stable, peacetime service economies, reveals its rigidity and fragility when faced with the realities of economic warfare and fragmented global supply chains. Nabiullina model, in direct opposition, is a defensive framework for survival, meticulously engineered to withstand maximum sanctions pressure. Her core belief is that when inflation is wielded as a geopolitical weapon, only the decisive power of the state can neutralize its threat. Her first move was a display of overwhelming force, the implementation of extreme capital controls and a shocking interest rate hike to 20%. The purpose of this hike was not to suppress domestic demand in the conventional sense, but to freeze the panic-driven capital flight and speculative attacks that threatened to implode the currency. While this action flew in the face of free market principles, it bought precious time and successfully prevented a catastrophic financial collapse. The long-term strategy was even more audacious, to fundamentally re-anchor the ruble to real assets, namely oil, gas, and gold. By enforcing a policy that required energy payments to be made in rubles, she directly linked the currency's value to tangible, globally demanded resources. This masterstroke effectively detached the ruble from the psychology of Western financial markets and stabilized its exchange rate, thereby mitigating the inflationary pressures of imported goods. On the supply side, the state initiated an aggressive and far-reaching program of import substitution and industrial localization. Inflation driven by shortages of foreign components and finished products was to be countered by systematically creating domestic alternatives. Through these measures, Nabiullina demonstrated a profound truth of crisis economics. Under the extreme duress of economic warfare, state power can be used to reshape the very structure of an economy, stabilizing prices and expanding critical defense production, even if it comes at the expense of market flexibility and traditional efficiency. It is crucial to acknowledge the trade-offs and long-term risks inherent in Nabiullina's approach. The opportunity cost of this model is significant, a degree of economic isolation, and a severe loss of credibility with global investors. The heavy-handed use of capital controls and direct state intervention makes Russia a far less attractive destination for the venture capital and advanced Western technology that are the lifeblood of modern innovation. This path risks long-term technological stagnation and a widening gap with the world's leading economies. In exchange for this, however, Russia gains an extraordinary degree of monetary sovereignty and a formidable resilience against financial sanctions. For a nation under siege, the imperative of survival may ultimately outweigh the pursuit of growth. The clash between these two models offers a powerful lesson. The correct economic policy is not a universal constant, but is instead dictated by the brutal realities of a nation's strategic circumstances.